All right, we are now in the third chapter of Jonah. We are in part 3 of this 5-part sermon series that is leading up to our retreat that's coming up in about 3 weeks. And I'm really excited about our summer retreat. It's the first one we've had in more than 5 years as a church. And so due to COVID and due to all of these issues that we've have had in the past, it's really nice to have our summer retreat once again. And the question, and today's sermon topic, the title is called Hear and Obey. And it comes out of Jonah chapter 3. And the question I had for each and every one of us to ponder throughout looking at this chapter is, what makes it so difficult to obey God? And to be honest, it is difficult to obey God. A lot of churches or a lot of pastors will say, hey, you have to obey, you have to listen to God's voice. But many times when we live our regular lives, 9 to 5 at our jobs, it's really hard to obey God. First of all, many times it's hard to listen to Him. How do we know what He's saying? How do we know what it is exactly that He's asking of us? Now, that's not the main part of today's sermon, but it's more of what makes it so difficult to obey God, in the sense that when He asks something of us, it's really difficult to say yes. Because many times, now the reasons it's difficult varies with every person. But for many of us, it's a loss of control. When God asks us to do something, it's very scary. There's a lot of fear of the unknown and what He might be calling us towards. For other people, I know for myself, when God called me into ministry, He told me to quit my current job that I was working at. And then He told me, I want you to serve me for the rest of your life. I want you to serve me. And that's a daunting task, to get rid of, to lay aside everything that you've known all your life and to go into a place of the unknown. And so for me, it was very difficult. It was an excruciating choice to make. At first, I tried to run away from it, but I realized the more I was running away from God, the more it was just useless for me. And until I finally submitted to God's voice. And so we're going to see through the book of Jonah today, particularly chapter 3, we're going to see why it was so difficult for someone like Jonah to hear God's voice and to actually obey His voice. There are some reasons that he did not want to obey His voice, and so we're going to go over those real quick today. I want to share with you, starting from verse 1 in the 3rd chapter. This is right after he gets spit out of the whale, of the fish, from the belly of the fish. And this is what the word says. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, and it said, the word of the Lord said, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message that I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now, there are a couple of things I want us to see in this text that is very clear. It said that the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Well, if it came a second time, that means there must have been a what? A first time in which God called him. And that is true. We see back in Jonah chapter 1, God called him to speak to the Ninevites, and he gave him a command. But do you remember, Jonah didn't want to listen to God. And so he ran away from God, and he ran away through the ocean, and there was a turbulent storm, and they made the sailors of the ship who were about to drown, threw him overboard, and then the ship and the seas were calm. This is the reason why God had to tell him a second time is because the first time it was too difficult to obey. And like I have shared even in my own life, when the first time God called me into full-time ministry, that was really daunting. And at first, I didn't want to do what God told me to do because it was so scary and it was too difficult. And so we see here in Jonah chapter 3 that even Jonah, a prophet of God, has a hard time saying yes to God. If you've ever been in a situation where God told you to do something, but you had a hard time saying yes, I want to encourage you this morning, even prophets of Old Testament, they have the same problem. This is not just a personal issue. This is a universal thing that is very difficult to do when God speaks to us. But why did it take God twice to tell him what to do? Well, we see it actually in some of you have to take a study of the Ninevites and this city in which he is telling Jonah to actually preach to. And this city is called the city of Nineveh. Now, in Jonah's day and age, the city of Nineveh was actually a huge city of the Assyrian nation, the nation of Assyria. And there were three things that really encapsulated and summarized the Assyrians. Number one, the first thing was they were a very violent and cruel society. The Assyrians were very violent and cruel. The Assyrian Empire, of which Nineveh is this major city, and this is a painting that was drawn about how great Nineveh was. It was known for its military might and its brutality against any enemy. The Assyrian records and historical accounts describe the conquests and the severe methods that they used to subjugate and intimidate other nations, including torture, mass executions, and other forms of extreme violence. Again, the Assyrians were a very cruel people. They were experts in torture. And they would when they invaded another country or another city, they would use really violent means. And just people around them did not like them very much. And so you can see Jonah, who is a Jewish person, a Jewish prophet, he was against this. He was like, God, these people are violent. I don't want to speak to them. I don't want to give them a chance of grace. You know what? No, these people, they deserve destruction. They deserve hell. They deserve the worst punishment. Even today, when you see violent cultures or violent armies or violent nations, we think the worst of them. And so I don't need to go into specifics, but think about in your head, who are violent people that you know in your mind. And so we think the worst of them, and that's what Jonah is going through. Another issue of the Assyrians was that they were highly into idolatry and moral corruption. The Ninevites practiced polytheism. There wasn't just one God, and they worshipped various gods and idols. From the perspective of biblical writers, actually, we see that the idolatry was seen as a direct affront to monotheistic worship of Yahweh. And so for somebody like Jonah, who believed in God as the Almighty, one great God, these Assyrians who would worship all these other gods, the sun god, the moon god, the god of plenty, the harvest, the god of weather, the god of sun and rain and stars. I mean, all these different gods. For someone like Jonah, who's a prophet, he's like, they don't believe in you, God. What's the purpose? Why should I even go tell them about you? They're not going to believe you. They believe in all these other gods. And so we see Jonah's reluctance, not only because they were violent, but because they were also idolatrous. And they had many different gods, and they were morally corrupt. And then finally, history tells us that the Assyrian Empire was huge on oppression and injustice. The Assyrian Empire's expansion was actually often accompanied by oppressive practices, including heavy taxation, forced labor, and the displacement of conquered peoples. These actions contributed to a reputation for injustice and exploitation, furthering their image as an evil nation. And so for the Jews, who were constantly oppressed by these Assyrians, Jonah saw the Ninevites as his worst enemy. And so it is no wonder that if God called you, let's say God asked you to go out into a country that you did not appreciate and you didn't like, a country that has a bad reputation, a country that oppresses its people, a country that is polytheistic, a country that, there's no rules, and the strongest man wins. Imagine God calling you to go to a country like that and speak to its people. You and I would have a hard time saying yes. Because it's a difficult ask. And many times it's hard to say yes to God's propositions. When he asks us to do something, it's hard to say yes because we fear so much of the unknown. What if they kill me? What if they take advantage of me? Or what if they take my family and kill them? Or what if they, there's so many different things that can happen. And so for many of us, one of the biggest reasons why it is hard to say yes to God is because we don't know the future. We don't know what's going to happen. And quite honestly, it's really scary to be in a place of the unknown. The second thing now, so it's interesting, but even in the midst of the unknown, God calls us towards obedience. And look at what it says in Jonah chapter 3 as we continue the verse that I just stopped before. Look at what it says. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Okay? Now, this is interesting, and it took a lot of study of me to really to fact check this. But if you take a look at this, what Jonah is doing is he goes into the city, right? The city that he hates. He doesn't want to be there. He doesn't like the people. He doesn't like the culture. And he goes in there, and on the first day, he goes in and he says, look, everybody, 40 days, and God is going to nuke this city. He's going to destroy this city. There is no mention of repentance. There is no mention of how can we change as a city. There is no assimilation. There's no care. He's just going around and he's just saying, look, everybody, you're going to be destroyed in 40 days. That's it. You can see Jonah doesn't really care about the Ninevites. This is like the least amount of effort that anybody put in to really speak to a nation and trying to convert them to Judaism, to believing in God. This was like a lazy missions trip. It would be like our kids taking the bags of toothbrush, toothpaste, and just tossing it into the city, of Denver, and not really caring about the people, not talking to them, and not actually engaging in them. Do you see what Jonah does? He is reluctantly obeying God's voice. Have you ever been there where God tells you to do something and you're so scared, or you don't really put all of your effort into it, but you put a minimal amount of effort and you're just like, I don't want to deal with these people. And that's kind of what Jonah's doing. He doesn't really care about these people. There is nothing in this passage and in the whole 3 chapters so far of Jonah where he really cares about these people. He really doesn't. He just goes in and tells a simple message that says, you're about to be destroyed. God's going to nuke you all. And I mean, what do you think the response would be from these people? These people who are violent, these people who are oppressive, and these people who are polytheistic. What do you think their response would be? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Look at what the very next verse says. This is amazing. Verse 5. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. This is a demonstration of God's power in the midst of man's reluctant obedience. Do you see this? This is amazing. What ends up happening is that the king hears this news that Jonah gives. And the king, from the top down, and the rest of the chapter explains everything that's happening. And if you look at the verses in the right after this, particularly in verses 8 and 9, if you look through 7, 8, and 9, this is what is written. It says here that the king issues a decree. And immediately after Jonah says the words, in reluctant obedience, the king tells all of his people, he says this, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. What is the king doing? He's calling a national fast. He's saying, everybody, I want you to fast because I want you to fast for God. And then verse 8, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. What is this? In the Old Testament, sackcloth was an outer garment that you would wear. You would get naked, put on a sackcloth, and it would represent you being repentant, you being sorry towards God. And this king, a polytheistic king, is telling all of his subject matters, all of his people, everybody put on sackcloth, let everyone call urgently on God. Call on God. This is a polytheistic king who never believed in God before. And now he's telling all of his people, the whole nation of Assyria, to call on God. And then he says, let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Do you see the words that this king uses? He is admitting to himself and all of his people that we have been a violent people, that we have treated our subjects wrong, that we have treated our enemies the wrong way. Can you imagine a king or a president of the United States or any statesman who actually comes on national television and says, ladies and gentlemen of the United States of America, we have done our enemies wrong. We need to repent. Could you imagine what the nation would look like if a leader admitted to their violent tendencies and their bad ways? And this is what the king does and tells everybody to do this. And then finally it says, who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Guys, what do you call this? I mean, Jonah went with a reluctant heart. And he said, in 40 days, I'm telling you guys, y'all going to be nuked for all the error of your ways. God is going to come and punish you. I mean, that was his message. To be honest, I would love to know, maybe, was that really God's message to him? I don't know. But here's the thing. Was it Jonah's words that changed the hearts of these people? Was it Jonah's words and actions that made these people turn around and this king to say, I am sorry, we are going to repent and we're going to call a national, change of attitude? Was that Jonah's words? No. It wasn't Jonah's words. It was God's power. It was his spirit that he was using through the obedience of one man, Jonah. See, God does not call you and I towards the impossible. I want you to know this. God does not call us for the impossible. God calls us to be obedient. And even in the midst of our reluctant obedience, God can take your obedience and through his spirit, through his power, he can change an entire nation. Let me ask each and every one of us, if God told us, see, God does not call us to things that are impossible. I know this because, again, the call even in my own life. But let's take, for example, our short-term missions trip, which all of you have witnessed, right? Do you think God, when God gave Pastor Unsu the idea first, a couple of months ago, when he gave him the idea about this short-term missions, do you think that God said, Pastor Unsu, I want you to take the CCC's youth group and I want you to go feed the homeless so that there's going to be no more problems with the homeless in Denver? Is that what God was asking Pastor Unsu to do? No, I don't think so. And if that is what God called Pastor Unsu to do from the beginning, I think Pastor Unsu would say, no, God, that's impossible. Our youth group of 15, 20 kids, we can't solve the problem of homelessness. That's too hard for us. Do you think God will call them towards something like that, impossible, that difficult? No, he doesn't. He just calls them towards obedience. And all God asked Pastor Unsu to do was, there's this opportunity to partner with a church in downtown Denver, and here's this opportunity. I want you to take it. And so Pastor Unsu came up to me a couple of months ago. This was back in like January or February. He said, hey, Pastor Howard, I have this idea. There's this opportunity where our youth group can go sleep for a week at this church where they go feed the homeless. What do you think about that? And I said, this sounds like a fantastic idea. And so we started to plan and prepare. And you know what ended up happening was what you saw in the pictures. But you didn't really see, if you really hear what the kids said this week, it wasn't just feeding the homeless. And they know they're not gonna solve Denver's homeless problem just because they went 1 week. But do you know what ended up happening? And by the way, I'm going to be honest. Don't share this with my son. But we just came back from Korea, and my son and my daughter, Sophie and Derek, they were having a hard time like saying yes to this because they were like, "Oh, Dad, we're jet lagged. We're really tired. I don't know if we want to go." And I was like, "Guys, I need you to pray about it. I need you to pray about it. And if God says go, you have to go. Just trust me." And so they prayed about it, and then on the final night, they said, yes, Pastor Unsu will go. And of course, Derek is reluctant, and he's dragging his pillow and his blanket. He's like, Dad, why do I have to go? I'm so tired. And at that time, I don't want to yell at him. I don't want to smack him and say, well, you got to go. You know, a man says he's going to go, you got to go. I mean, that's what my father did, right? But, you know, I don't want to raise him that way and, you know, have major issues like me when I grow up. Where you have to see a therapist, you know. But guys, when he came back, I mean, the stories he was telling me, Dad, these guys that are homeless, you know, they know so much. And I was like, yeah? Tell me some of the stories they shared. Well, there's this one guy, he was in Vietnam in the 70s, and he was telling me about war and all these things, and how when he came back, you know, the government didn't support him, and, you know, but he's been living off the streets all this time. But he's so smart, Dad. He's so smart. Why is he homeless? You know, and I have an answer to that. And then he said, man, Dad, Owen and Austin are so cool, you know, and Taylor, she's so awesome. I mean, they bonded, you know, and he was telling me about Ethan and all these things that they all did together as a group. And I was just like, wow, this is the reward for obedience. God's not asking us to do impossible things. He's only asking us to be obedient. And when we are obedient to him, he will make pathways open like you never thought before. I did not imagine that a Vietnam War veteran would speak to my son in such a way. How could I even plan this? This was beyond my imagination. This was beyond my plans. And all God asks of you and me is simple obedience. And when we say yes to him and his ways, I promise you, he will open up the doors. He will give you new adventures. He will take you to places you never thought were possible. And for someone like Jonah, a reluctant missionary who went out and just was obedient to God's word, he helped change an entire nation to be under God. How can you and I be more obedient to him? Don't look at what you fear. Don't look at what, you know, possibly could or could not happen. Don't look at all of those things, but keep your eyes focused on God, and he will make all of your paths straight. Let's go to the Lord in prayer this morning as we reflect upon this.